Morning all. Let's have a look this morning at the round 11 encounter. Fischer against Tal again in round 11. Fischer played e4. Remember, in this tournament each player in theory was playing each other player 4 times. It was quite a long, grueling all play all as such. So Mikhail Tal played the Sicilian defence, and we see after knight f3, knight c6. Now knight c6 can go into many different variations still of the Sicilian. We see after d4, c takes d4, knight takes d4. Black doesn't elect, for example, for g6, but in fact plays e5. Another option, as well as e5, might be knight f6 to encourage knight c3 to avoid a Maroczy bind, trying to encourage white to block the c pawn. But this move e5 can either go now into usually the Lowenthal variation. After knight b5, the Lowenthal is a6, immediately inviting knight d6, or the Kalashnikov is d6. Now in d6 it looks very much like a Sicilian Sveshnikov, but there's a key difference. The knight is still there and this knight is still there, so white doesn't have to play knight c3 to go back in to Sveshnikov. White could play, for example, bishop c4. There are other options, but actually in this game we don't get a Kalashnikov, we get Lowenthal variation. So if you remember, Lowenthal was one of the first masters to play Paul Morphy, so it's a very, very old variation of the Sicilian defence. Lowenthal actually created one of the first books on Morphy, Morphy's collected games, and had agreement for Morphy to use his name for that book as well. So he played quite a pivotal role in marketing Morphy's games, masterpieces, which we've enjoyed greatly on this channel. So this variation named after him, a6, it encourages knight d6 check. And you might think this is a really good thing for white, surely, to get this dark squared bishop. And also this d pawn is likely to remain backward. Black surely can't play king e7. The only move here is taking. Queen takes d6. And the idea of this variation is to try and get a lead in development. And this next move is key to the whole variation. The most popular move to follow up now for black is queen f6. And you might think, can white just consider taking on f6 here? The most popular move is the full retreat, queen retreat, queen d1. Although queen takes f6 is quite popular as well. 155 games for queen d1. Queen takes f6, 139. Queen c7, 75. Okay, so in the game we see actually queen going all the way back to d1. And this keeps a lot more interest in the game with queens on, clearly. And in fact black seems to have quite an aggressive and useful move here, queen g6. Okay, this variation remains popular today. It's just been played in British Championship in one round. Simon Williams was playing with the black pieces against Jack Rudd just in the British Championship just gone. So this is still alive and kicking, this variation. What is white meant to do here? Well, knight c3 is a very logical move, and now black has got 2 key options in this variation. This first one might seem a bit crazy, d5, and the next one is knight ge7. These are the 2 most popular options here. So d5 with 71 games and knight ge7 with 67 games. Knight f6 just 8 games. Okay, so in this game we see Mikhail Tal playing knight ge7. Okay, and now white usually tries to get rid of this pressure on g2 by playing h4, trying to kick that queen away. Black responds with h5, which weakens a bit the g5 square, so that's quite useful for a bishop going there. A bishop does go there now. And in this position, the most popular move, which is played by Mikhail Tal, is d5. Okay, now here it's interesting. In the game, Fischer actually played bishop takes e7. This is actually a rare bird move, only with 2 games here. The most common move for white to play in this position is e takes d5. For example, knight b4, which not only attacks c2 but also puts pressure on d5. So it's maybe slightly superior to d4 in that respect. It seems the more popular than knight d4. Bishop takes e7, king takes e7, bishop d3. Taking, that's another idea that you can just take this bishop if bishop d3. Taking, and this is a game here which is interesting. After b5, bishop b7, black can try and get the pawn back and should be okay. Okay, but in the game we actually see the more unusual move here being played. Bishop takes e7. So Mikhail Tal now plays the move, maybe slightly surprising to see this, but just d4. So temporarily black is a piece down, and let's put on a Qxd6 to see this position. What engines think? It's about equal. This idea looks perfectly sound from an engine point of view. It looks quite, knight d5, we just take on e4, and black's better. We just take on d5 after. So it's difficult for white to meet this. Fischer played actually bishop g5, so offering the knight now. So d takes c3, black's restored material equality. And in fact, with taking the e-pawn, which seems like a very nice thing to have. So b takes c3, queen takes e4 check. And white now plays bishop e2. And technically, black's doing fine here. Even though white's got the bishop pair, from an engine point of view, this looks like a very nice position for black. Mikhail Tal could have perhaps continued with bishop f5, just putting more pressure on c2. The move he played was actually f6. Bishop drops back, and now we see bishop g4. Okay, so white cannot clearly play f3 because the queen at e3 now, so that affords bishop g4 here. We see queen d3, and the queens come off. C takes d3, undoubling white's pawns, which you might think is favourable, but on the other hand, white has just lost the bishop pair. Bishop takes e2, king takes e2. So what's going on here? Castling queenside now. Now rook ad1. Okay, black seems to have a very nice position. Without the bishop pair, can white really grind out anything here? Or can black do something with this d3 pawn as a target? We see knight e7. So the knight's heading for a seemingly very strong square here, the d5 square. Fischer plays d4. And we see knight d5 now. Threatening immediately knight takes c3 check. That's defended. Rook he8. So black looks very nicely coordinated. If white just plays d takes e5, then black does look a lot better here. Rook takes e5. This looks very bad, fragmented pawns. White wants to keep the pawns together here. He plays rook hd1. And now we see f5. And it looks quite dangerous that actually maybe f4 is on the cards to squeeze that bishop. And the king is in the firing line here. But even with the king on e2 and the rook here, Fischer dares to play bishop g5. So there seems to be a useful discovered check before moving the rook available. Let's have a look. E takes d4 check. If this was played, let's say king f3. And now, what can black do rather? He has to move the rook surely, and then taking here. If he doesn't move the rook, let's have a look at d takes. This is interesting though as well to consider, just sacking the exchange. Bishop takes, rook d4. This might actually be okay to play from an engine point of view. There's nothing too critical here. It's the exchange down for a couple of pawns. It seems to be about equal actually, so that's an interesting continuation. But in the game we don't get that. We see just rook d7. Okay, and now Fischer plays d takes e5, seemingly leaving that weak pawn just expressed earlier. Rook takes e5, king f3. Okay, it's about equal here though. Rook e4, and we see now rook d3, trying to build up pressure maybe on d5. Rook c4, that c3 pawn is probed. Rook, now a very interesting move now is played. Very, very interesting. In fact, I wonder if you can guess it. I think it is a star move. It's a rook move. Okay, that's a bit of a clue. Maybe I shouldn't have said that, because there aren't too many valid rook moves here actually. If I give you 10 seconds starting from now, can you predict Fischer's move in this position? Okay, he actually goes for a pawn sack with rook cd1, offering the c3 pawn, and the idea here is to try and further activate the king. We see Mikhail Tal taking on c3, rook takes c3, knight takes c3. The rooks attack rook c1, rook c7. White potentially can try and get the king in, not at the moment because he's going to lose the rook if king f4. He plays bishop f4, but potentially the king is gaining access to f4. For the moment the black rook moves. Now bishop e5, knight d5, and still there's no access to f4 to speak of, so white's a full pawn down. So what's going to happen? Is this king really going to get access to f4? Rook d1 now. Knight goes to f6, and it's here that now king f4 is available tactically, revealing compensation immediately for the sacrificed pawn. So king f4. Okay, so f5 is under pressure. What can black do? Well, he can defend that, but g5 is a hole here, so the king can venture potentially to g5 one day. But for the moment, the knight is shut down a bit with f3, taking away these two squares. We see knight d7, bishop d6 now, trying to cut down the activities of the knight. And here maybe is a slight concern, this next move. I think black has to play very accurately, but it should be, in theory, even with this seemingly menacing threat, perhaps black can hold equality in this critical position. Let's see how black can easily go wrong though. The king is very active. If knight c5, let's have a quick look at knight c5. King g5, it starts perhaps to go a bit downhill here. Now, in this position, I don't think we can. After b6, it's preparing a neat trap actually. If king takes, then knight b7 on d6, so that indirectly defends g6. But white should still be okay here with pressure with bishop g3, and then rook d6. So trying to make sure this g6 is still kept under pressure. And this kind of position should start to be very nice for white, a slight advantage. Okay, but in the game we didn't see knight c5. That might be a nearly playable move, but maybe knight b6 is also another interesting move. If we look at king g5 again, knight c4 attacking the bishop, bishop f4, And black should be able to hold the balance here, it seems, with rook e6. If black can hold on to g6, then his pawns are not too vulnerable. So it all depends on that here for white emerging with a significant advantage or not. So this kind of position looks fairly solid. But white is definitely not losing, it's about equal. But in the game we see actually, maybe this is a key slight inaccuracy, rook c2. The rook does seem active, it's forked 2 pawns here. Fischer plays g3, but he's really looking forward now to king g5. We see rook e2 here, which might be again slipping down a slippery slope a little bit. Let's see in this position. Again, knight b6. Is king g5 possible here? Rook c6. There's always the idea of knight c4 on king g6. This is perhaps as a key delaying defense for g6 being knocked out. So this kind of position seems quite stubborn. But anyway, so in the game we see actually after g3 we saw actually rook e2, and it's here that king g5 maybe is giving white a significant advantage. What's actually happened here? The rook comes to defend like this. Now bishop f4 has the key threat of rook d6. So this g6 pressure is being felt here. We see knight f8, rook d6. And this is definitely giving white now a clear advantage. The king is now gaining access to other key dark squares potentially on the rook exchange like f6. Okay. Black actually dare not, after rook d6, dare not take this rook. If he took the rook here, takes, his pawn structures fall into bits here after king takes g6. f5 and h5 weak. So bishop e5. These pawns are now forked. So king takes f5, and white can look forward to potentially 2 connected passed pawns on the king side. That'll be all over. So this is really intense pressure now. Tal tries a5, and actually the pressure continues now. Instead of using f6, remarkable king walk here, king h6. Not minding any discovered check, that's harmless. Here, on g5 check, we just take the rook maybe, and bishop takes g5, and that's fine. Brilliant for white. So king h6 is putting on great pressure now. Tal tries rook e2 here. Okay, and in this position, this a pawn is a bit of an issue. Perhaps a4 can be considered, leaving a lot of pressure on black. But and maybe a threat of bishop g5, rook d8 is effective here. But instead of a4, there's another way to defend the a2 pawn. Fischer chose instead rook d2. So the rook goes back to e7. Now why to e7? Isn't that encouraging bishop d6? Okay, let's have a look at rook. If the rook went back to e6 instead, then unfortunately king g7 is starting to look a bit nasty. If the knight now goes to d7, then check here is dangerous, really dangerous all of a sudden. Potentially black can be getting mated, for example, like this. This would be quite embarrassing. So he needs to be careful about his own king safety here in these variations. And if he has to exchange off rooks, then that's a disaster. White can start munching with king takes g6. So rook e6 seems to be just refutable here. Let's go back. After rook d2, rook e6 is not so hot because of king g7 and then check here. So rook e7 was played by Mikhail Tal. So can Fischer make headway here? Well, bishop d6 is attractive. Check, Okay, the king's driven back to g5, but it's threatening to pop now into f6. So we see rook f7 to try and stop the king going to f6. And now Fischer plays rook b2. What's the threat? You might ask here, couldn't not Fischer, can you not just take on f8 to take on g6? This isn't so effective here. Perhaps if king takes g6, for example, then check, rook takes g3, and let's say rook d5, a4, rook takes f5, rook g2. Black has some chances here. The king's kind of stranded here in front of his own pawn. a2 is vulnerable. Black has some chances, but okay, so Fischer with his rook d2 move maintained a lot more tension and pressure in the position. He didn't go in for bishop takes f8 trying to cash out like that. He just kept the tension going with rook b2. Rook b5 perhaps to get the a pawn. Tal plays now f4, which seems a little bit of a desperate move, giving up a pawn just for a check here. Is this a dangerous check? The king's got h6, but the idea of stopping rook b5 is clear. b5, so Tal maintains his 2-1 here. But now bishop d6, undermining again g6. If we can get this knight to go away from g6. Tal decides here to play b4. This suppresses completely rook b5's now, and looks forward to rook takes f3 in the future. Is this enough? Fischer now plays g4, a very, very powerful move. g4. Black doesn't want to maintain white's f-pawn on the exchange, getting out of the firing line. I don't think this is any good. Let's see, hg, fg. This is just better for white. So Tal plays what looks to be the best move. Rook takes f3. But now white's pawns are getting quite dangerous after g5, still with the threat of taking here and then taking here, and this g-pawn is going to be dangerous. Knight e6 now, just offering g6 like this. King takes g6. So h5 is now under great pressure. Rook d3. Bishop steps out of the way. Rook e3. And the king steps back here, making way for the g-pawn. So foregoing the h5. Was there a way to avoid this hassle on the bishop? Because surely white wanted that pressure on h5 here. Perhaps other ways, bishop f6. But then there's always here the tricky knight f4, kicking the king away from h5 in any case. So Fischer just accepted king f5 in this position. Take it slowly. The g-pawn is available now for pushing. Knight f8, and now to celebrate the g-pawn, rook g2. Try and push this g-pawn without any knight set to get the bishop here, so the king can't participate with king g6 without rook e5. But now with rook g2, g6 is now on the cards. Rook f3 check, bishop f4. So white's major threat now is simply g6. King d7, g6. The knight tries to block with knight e6 and potentially on f4 here. Did Fischer just blunder? No, he pushes with g7, allowing this temporary piece sacrifice. Rook takes f4 check, king e5. Things are now really critical. Black has to give up the exchange here. And he plays the exchange sack in a very stylish way with rook f8, giving up the exchange to get rid of that pawn. What else is there in this position for black? The pawn's going to queen. If knight takes g7, then that's even worse, because rook takes g7 check and then taking the rook. So rook f8. So Fischer going up the exchange now. G takes f, knight takes. King d5, keeping the king away from the pawns. a4, check, pushing the king to the back row. King d6, Okay, this is absolutely winning for white, this position. Black tries b3, and white just plays a3 now. And here Mikhail Tal resigned. So let's have a look why. If b2, precise move check here, king d8, because now this is a double threat of taking in a pawn and to mate here with rook b8 mating. So what does black do here? This is terrible. This is all over. He has to give up here. And now rook b4 would start mopping up black. The exchange up and past a pawn is absolutely decisive. So a phenomenal game there, and there was a very key pawn sacrifice, a bit reminiscent of Capablanca's famous pawn sacrifice in the endgame against Tartakoa, where he got a very aggressive king. Here, a very aggressive king. If we go back to the key position, it looks as though from the opening, when I mentioned about this weak c3 pawn, that the slight compensating factor was the king on f3. This king not as aggressive, and this very slight compensating factor of the king is an aggressive piece in the endgame, was made use of with the ingenious rook cd1. And it takes a few moves even for the king to be able to make use of f4, as we saw in the game after this pawn sack. First these moves necessary, rook c7 because the knight's pinned, and in this position the knight goes back. So eventually here, after rook d1, we get the situation, I think by force actually, if rook c5, well, bishop takes g7, so we get a situation where king f4, and that's where all the pressure began, and we have that magnificent endgame. So a huge amount of pressure with the king being exerted on the dark squares on Mikhail Tal's king side here. So a fantastic game, and a very instructive practical pawn sacrifice demonstrated here to get the king so aggressive and so active. Comments or questions on YouTube. Thanks very much.